Hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, the Biden administration just did not extend, but implemented a brand new eviction moratorium, one that the media is saying is much more limited than the former moratorium, which we will get to in a moment. But it comes off of the hills of a protest done by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Congresswoman Cori Bush, the latter of whom actually slept outside on the Capitol steps and said that she was going to protest on behalf of the marginalized renters and people who are under the threat of eviction as Congress suspended to go into its August recess. And she also mentioned the privilege of Congress people and how it's cruel for them to go to recess when people are apparently going to be evicted in droves. So, my friends, there are a lot of things going on in this particular equation here. But, as I always say here, on this channel and in Pensive Politics in general, we must go beneath the surface to understand what is actually happening, to understand what is actually happening on the surface in terms of our political dynamics. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the eviction moratorium came into effect in September of 2020, and it was extended 4 times. That's right. 4 times over the course of its history. The most recent period being between June and July 31st, which just expired a few days ago on July 31st. Is this video being made. Now, the justification for the moratorium was that it would cause that evictions would cause COVID to spread around faster because people who got evicted would be moving into group homes or they would be going other places to make up for being evicted. In fact, the CDC's initial order said the following: eviction moratoria, like quarantine, isolation, and social distancing, can be an effective public health measure utilized to prevent the spread of communicable disease. So they have made an economic issue, and which has become a moral issue, a public health issue. I'll address that in a moment as well. So, a new limited moratorium was just put in place by the Biden administration in response to the pressure of Cori Bush and AOC and the Senate and House Democrats. Even though President Biden lacks the legal and constitutional authority to do so, and he's kind of admitted that as well, it has been put in place to only be effective in places that, as the order itself says, are experiencing substantial and high spread of coronavirus, which happens to be a good majority of the country. So basically, the moratorium is in place for basically the entire country. So, my friends, let's understand the ethics of all of this. Because the decision, when a decision is made to employ force against anyone, that is an ethical decision. The CDC made a decision to employ force against landlords. That is a decision that must be evaluated on an ethical basis. So, the CDC's ethical calculus was that a lot of people could potentially get hurt by this one thing. Therefore, we must do this one thing to prevent the potentiality of hurt. So 2 things. Very rarely, almost never, is a potentiality of a bad outcome ever a justified ethical decision. That is not the foundation for a justified ethical decision. Because, my friends, potentiality is a sort of contingent, ever-moving thing. It is a reality that dogs all of us. Probability is something that will dog all of us for the rest of our lives until we are in the grave. That's why so many things in life are so uncertain. Yet, the CDC wants to use the potentiality of eviction, not even the certainty, because the certainty of eviction would pose a very different ethical question. The potentiality of eviction to employ the certainty of force onto someone, that itself is not stable grounds for any coherent moral or ethical decision. That's strike 1. Strike 2. When the CDC says that we believe that these evictions will cause COVID to spread, they are once again going into the potentiality of that happening, rather than using any sort of stable, concrete data to provide that people would necessarily get COVID by simply moving around. There were plenty of people throughout the pandemic who were able to move around in safe ways with their masks or whatever and not get COVID. Once again, now they have gone from using a potentiality to assuming a certainty and then basing their entire decision on this potential certainty. Do you see how ethically dangerous all of this is, my friends? This is the problem with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says this is what's probably good for the most amount of people, or what is good in general. Therefore, it is good, period. And of course, this leaves a lot of questions to be open. So the ethical calculus of this eviction moratorium is significantly flawed. And we'll get into why beyond the flaws it's immoral as well. But before I do that, my friends, I know there's going to be someone who watched this video and says, well, Mr. Watson, you're being so insensitive. How could you want millions of people to be evicted and go out in the streets? How could you not care about the children? There will be some kind of appeal, some kind of lame appeal to emotion like that. And let me just say this. As someone himself who has been the subject of an eviction process early on in his life, I understand the situation. I understand that it is harsh. It is difficult. It is not whatsoever easily mentally or emotionally, especially in an area when a plague is ravaging the entire country. But I also understand that morality does not wait for me to be inconvenienced or convenienced. What is right must be right, regardless of whatever particular circumstance, and what is wrong must be wrong, if we are to have any stable, coherent idea of what morality is. If morality goes away because I'm inconvenienced personally, then we have no morality. And in all honesty, that is a far more dangerous outcome for those of you who like to look at outcomes instead of principles than any single person being evicted. But I'm going to tell you why it's really unlikely that folks would have been evicted in the first place absent of the moratorium. But before I do that, let's go back to my initial point. Why eviction moratoriums are immoral. So I deduced this, my friends, from first principles. One of my favorite theorists, my favorite philosophers, who was a giant of what we call the Scottish Enlightenment, where these thinkers in Scotland were going back and forth with each other about the nature of humanity and political society and the intellectual moral foundations of their area. They were going back and forth, and they were exchanging so many ideas. And one of them, called Lord Kames Henry Holmes, who was a jurist in Scotland, he made this point about the ownership of property. He said there is a peculiar connection betwixt a man and the fruits of his industry, felt by everyone, which is the very thing we call property, where all the conveniences of life, like air and water, provided to our hand without labor, or were we disposed to labor for the public without any selfish affections, there would be no sense of property. At least such a sense would be superfluous and unnecessary. But when self-preservation, the most eminent of our principles of actions, directs every individual to labor for himself in the first place, man, without a sense or feeling of property, would be an absurd being. Every man, therefore, must have a notion of property with regard to the things acquired by his own labor, and this is the very meaning of working for oneself. Property, so far, is necessarily connected with self-preservation. So Holmes has established here, through reason, that property is not merely something that you own out there in the wild. Property is quite literally tied to our understanding of how we preserve ourselves. It is the animating principle of life. We are all self-owning. And so, the principle of self-ownership actually undergirds the relationship between a tenant and a landlord. Watch this. The landlord is saying, you know what? I have used my property, my ability as a human being, my labor. I've mixed it with nature. This is what Locke says is required for property to exist, mixing labor with nature. And I've created this unit, or I have purchased this unit. I've done something to acquire this unit legitimately. And I'm going to give you this unit for X period of time by this contract, and I need you to do the following things for me. Any incidents, especially an external incidents, that would say, you know what? Your property means nothing, your terms mean nothing, is an invalidation not merely of something out in the wild, objects, it's an invalidation of the animating principle of human life. So quite literally, the eviction moratorium goes against the contract which ensured that the transaction between the landlord and the tenant was happening in the first place, the very base of that relationship. It violates that, then it also violates the landlord's very principle, which allows them to operate in this world at all, property. That is immoral, my friends. When you go against life itself in a way like that, that is unjust. So yes, in every instance, that would be immoral, even if it inconveniences the tenant. However, I understand that this does not please people. Many of you will say, well, Christian, it doesn't matter. Landlords are greedy, and the renters will go out, and what about their rights or whatever? Well, again, the renter entered into a contract with the landlord. The renter had their rights and still has their rights in that contract, and the landlord has the right to terminate that contract whenever they want to. However, reason would dictate to us that landlords, especially in a period where COVID has made economic conditions so harrowing, have no interest in actually doing that. What do I mean? So, for example, my friends, the principle of self-interest, if we agree that self-preservation is important and survival is important, the principle of self-interest naturally follows. Landlords have no interest in losing tenants, especially during a time like COVID, where there's no one else who would be willing to replace those tenants or who will be able to replace those tenants. So if we are to believe self-interest, landlords are actually more amenable to collaborate with tenants in these distressing conditions, which means that independent of a eviction moratorium, it actually is more likely under a harrowing economic circumstance that a landlord might actually work with a tenant on rent. And guess what? Many have. Here's the problem, though, and this is, we have to look at this by observation, by empiricism, because so far we've established that the CDC is looking at this solely from the lens of this sort of abstract idea of what it means to be evicted, or this abstract idea of possibilities. The CDC is not actually looking in reality and looking at the empirical data to understand what is going on in the ground floor. And this underlies the disconnect between many of the people in the intelligentsia and many of us on the ground. When you actually live in the world of form, when you actually live in objective reality, you must go by what you see, and you must interpret that through reason. You don't start with reason and then try to interpret and to try to create what you want to see. But the problem is the CDC has created what they wanted to see. They have created the possibility of evictions to be a certainty. They have used the vague term of public health to make that certainty appear even more certain, even more scary. And they have used fear as a mechanism by which to legislate an immoral proposition. But we'll get into that in a moment. The problem, my friends, as observation will tell us, is that landlords across America, throughout the pandemic, have said many of their tenants either are not eligible for the CDC eviction moratorium, which requires you to make no more than $99,000 a year, or if you're a couple, no more than $198,000 a year, according to the Wall Street Journal's report in the moratorium. Also, there's been $25 billion under the CARES Act passed in early 2020 in rental assistance out there that actually is meant to forestall the possibility of having an eviction moratorium. But according to a Pew Trust article, landlords across the country, particularly in Texas as well, have complained that many of their tenants refuse to apply to rental assistance and other programs that could help them pay their rent. Furthermore, after the passage of the CARES Act, 14.5 million Americans said earlier this year in April 2021, that they had no idea if they could pay their rent or not. Again, there's $25 billion rental assistance. Many landlords actually had to apply for assistance themselves because many small landlords are going under because they're not able to pay their mortgage. And so the landlords have been giving their tenants this information, and many of them have not been taking it. And those that have are most likely not at risk for eviction. Reason.com reported that Kathy Howard of a Baltimore area property management company, Regional Management, told them that earlier in June, that about 100 of her company's 5,000 tenants are neither paying rent nor trying to sign up for rent relief. So yes, there is a contingent of people who simply do not want health. No amount of money is going to be a substitute for personal responsibility, my friends. Money cannot cure a deficiency in our own ability to survive. If we lack that survival mechanism, or we are so lazy to neglect the extent of our faculties to push us through difficult situations, then no amount of money or welfare is going to be able to let people survive. So here's my point, my friends. The basis for these eviction moratoriums is nonsensical in and of itself, in principle, because you cannot justify the certainty of an action through potentiality. It is not more because it violates the contract established between tenants and landlords. And it doesn't even consider the fact that there are so many other contingencies like rent rental assistance in place right now, which can help people, but there are still millions of Americans who have their heads stuck in the sand despite being given information by their landlords that would help them pay this. So what did Cori Bush do? We're going to wrap this up very soon. Cori Bush slept in the steps of the Capitol and used the aesthetic of suffering to evoke a point of rage in people. The aesthetic of suffering to sort of drive up action from emotion. And the problem with my friends with using aesthetics to evoke action or emotion to evoke action is that it actually prevents us from engaging in a rational, principled, philosophical conversation about the merits of a particular position. The merits of eviction moratoria, I just walked through several arguments against them, a philosophical one and an empirical one. But yet, those don't seem to matter when Cori Bush is on the steps of the Capitol saying that all renters are automatically marginalized and Congress is being elitist by not going ahead and confirming that sentiment by using more force to continue more immorality and to ignore the circumstances that are actually on the ground, to ignore the fact that many renters still have the possibility, the extremely and present possibility to forestall eviction and crisis by simply applying for assistance, by simply not being ignorant. Or by simply understanding that landlords are people like them, with bills like them, and are willing to work with them, come rain, shine, or whatever, especially in conditions like this. But the aesthetic of Cori Bush sleeping on those steps evokes much more action than the logic of what I just said. My friends, we must check ourselves. I'm closing with this. If we want to have a coherent conversation about ethics in American politics, and we want to deduce from that conversation the proper mode of being and action, we need to stop with the emotional ploys. We need to reject utilitarianism. We need to understand that personal responsibility exists, possibilities exist, and you do not need to immorally force someone, wring someone's neck, wring someone's hands to create an outcome that may be desirable. Perhaps if you just let people work on their own affairs, with the tools they've been given and the tools they naturally possess, perhaps things will work out better. If my reasoning through the duration of this video is correct, that assumption is most certainly going to be more of a certainty than the CDC's scaremongering about evictions in a period of undilated financial aid and landlords who are desperate to stay above water themselves. Think on it. My friends, I love you. If you love me, patreon.com/officialcwatson, officialcwatson@gmail.com, or locals, christianwatson.locals.com, or you can join my Discord link down below. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.